Today is Wednesday, August 31st, 2011. I'm Matthew T.G.
I'm Heath Mullican.
And I'm Tony Casey. Welcome to the Technology Show, a weekly podcast featuring technology, theology, and everything in between. The world's only user-antagonistic podcast. This is episode 121.
Woohoo!
So, I know that our listeners and viewers are noticing that Steve Stanley, for the second week in a row, is not in studio. I think that we forgot to mention last week that Steve is in Kansas City, and he is currently at Nazarene Theological. He is in the midst of Master of Divinity. I think this is his last year for that.
He's also spending a stinking amount of time on Facebook. My word. How does he get work done? And all the things that he's putting up on Facebook. Steve, get to work, get off Facebook.
There you go. All right, we had a giveaway last week, and so Matthew, why don't you tell our listeners who won that?
Yeah, we gave away a copy of Dr. Weitzel's book, Spiritual Waypoints. Chris Sumter won that, and so this is our first international book giveaway. We will be shipping to Mongolia. So, Tony, I'm excited to see what you pay for shipping on that.
Yeah, well, listen, we'll also offer for him the Kindle version if that's what he'd rather have.
If it's available. We don't know if that's available yet. In fact,
well, that's true. We'll check. We'll check. If it's available, we'll offer that option to you. And so just let us know. Otherwise, get us your address, and we'll get this in the mail and get it going to Mongolia, our very first international
Let me just
giveaway.
Let me just stop Steven in his tracks before he starts saying that Sumter's not going to get his book.
Is he whining?
No, he's not. I just want to stop it before the check is in the mail. The book is going out. It's right here.
Yeah, Steven, I want you to know that I'm the one in charge of mailing this out, okay? So
and you'll be using like an international carrier. The USPS will have nothing to do with this mailing. So
all right, listen, Matthew, we may have some first-time listeners, so for those that don't know how to get into the chat room, could you give them a little bit of direction?
If you're watching on our show's site, you can log into the chat room right there. You have to have a Ustream account to do that, but as you start to type a message and send it, it'll ask for credentials. If you don't have them, you can create them right there from the site. Log in with those. You'll be able to chat. Once you've got those created, if you'd prefer to use an IRC client, you are welcome to do that as well. That's what I've been using lately, and I like that way of chatting. It's just a lot simpler and a lot cleaner than our friend Ustream's option that they make available. So check out the IRC channel, and the instructions are there on the site, thetechnologyshow.com/live.
We really want to encourage our listeners today to take advantage of the chat room. Have two wonderful guests with us, and we want to go ahead and welcome Bob and Paige to the show. Dr. Bob Cranston is a board-certified neurologist. He received his medical degree from the University of Illinois and a Master of Arts in Bioethics from Trinity Graduate School. He chairs the Ethics Committee of Carle Foundation Hospital, where he's on staff. He's a fellow of the American Academy of Neurology, a clinical associate professor of medicine at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign College of Medicine, medical director for medical subspecialties at Carle Physician Group, and he serves on the Christian Medical and Dental Association's Bioethics Committee. Before her untimely death, Bob was married to his wife Barbara for almost 34 years. Together they produced 3 wonderful children. Dr. Cranston currently lives in Champaign, Illinois. Bob, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
All right. I also want to welcome Paige Cunningham. She is the Executive Director of the Center for Bioethics and Human Dignity. She's also a fellow at the Wilberforce Forum's Council for Biotechnology Policy, a fellow at the Institute for Biotechnology and the Human Future, and a trustee of Taylor University. She's an adjunct professor of law at Trinity Law School and Trinity Graduate School. She graduated from Taylor University and earned her J.D. from Northwestern University Law School and an M.A. in Bioethics from Trinity International University. Paige lectures and has published numerous articles, editorials, and book chapters in areas of law, bioethics, and public policy, and has testified before congressional committees at the state and national level and has appeared frequently on radio and television. She's married to Jay Cunningham. Together they have 3 children. She currently lives in West Chicago, Illinois. Paige, welcome to the show.
Hey, it's good to be here.
Paige is also a fellow PhD student of mine at Trinity International, and it's just great having both of them with us today. All right, we want to talk bioethics, and especially we want to get into this book right here, Bioethics and Today's Christian. This is a book that Dr. Bob Cranston authored. Before we jump into the book, let's kind of lay a little groundwork here and just ask the simple question, why bioethics? Paige, we'll start with ladies first, and then after she's done, Bob, you jump right in. Paige?
Bioethics deals with, I think, the most significant questions of the late 20th and early 21st century. In the last century, we were dealing with the questions of who counts as a human being, who's part of the human family. And we found that embryos, the very old, the very ill, the very disabled were marginalized and often shoved away from the table of the human family. In the 21st century, we're dealing with the questions of what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to flourish as a human? And as Christians, what does it mean to be made in the image of God? And so these are the most profound questions of human existence. That's why bioethics matters.
Yeah. Bob?
I think that the overarching purposes of God don't change. I mean, they've been timeless and they will be timeless and eternal. And as Christians, we are linked to those at all times. However, I think, as Paige has pointed out, there are unique periods in time where we have unique responsibilities. And I really feel like right now, in the last 40 years and in the next 20 or 30 years, should God tarry, should Christ tarry, we're going to look back on this as a time when everything changed. And if we're not involved in that change process, if we're not heading it down safe lanes and godly lanes, we're going to have a lot to regret. So I think we have this opportunity that we can't miss.
Paige, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think when we had you on the show about a year and a half ago, you talked a little bit about Roe versus Wade and the fact that you felt like the church just never was on board with that, and before, but by the time the church was on board, the law was already passed. And don't you feel like that's kind of where we are right now in the church as far as bioethics, and that the church is just not up to speed?
Yeah, I would agree with that, Tony. When I say the church, I'm really thinking about the evangelical church because I work within the evangelical tradition. The Roman Catholic Church, at least their theologians, have been engaged in this for a long time, and we are sort of the newcomers at the table. So whether all Roman Catholic followers adhere to the teaching, at least the teaching exists, but we don't have that kind of single source of theological teaching within the evangelical church. That's kind of the nature of being a Protestant. And so we have not had that sort of prophetic voice to alert us to what's going on. And so I think most people have assumed that their lives are going pretty well, they've got strong families and kids, and they're just consumed with their own life, and they don't realize that outside their own family, these issues are not just happening, but the values behind them are being set for all of society in ways that are going to ultimately be very, very destructive. So yes, I think we were late on the abortion question. It was not an issue when Roe versus Wade was discussed. I remember that. I was in college. And the things that have been happening in end-of-life questions and assisted reproduction, human enhancement, I don't think most evangelicals are aware of what's going on.
Well, certainly this is where Bob's book comes in because you address this and you really produce something for the church. So just talk a little bit about the genesis of your book, Bob, and how it came about.
Well, even before I do that, I need to just applaud Paige's comment. I think, there are times when if you don't get on it, then everything afterwards is just reactive. And the reactive stuff just doesn't work nearly as well as anticipating.
Oh, very good.
On the other hand, Yogi Bear has some comment, and I'm sure I can't remember it, but the difficulty about predicting the future is that it hasn't happened yet. and sometimes we start down tracks and we get really tied up, and then it turns out to not be anything. I think of the Y2K thing and how some Christians got very involved in that, and it turned out to be nothing. Having said that, though, to answer your question, I got to my job as a neurologist, and I was enjoying my work, but part of me said I'd really like to be involved in the whole system, And as a Christian, how can I be better involved in our whole hospital system and clinic system? And, you know, there are a number of committees, and I looked at them and I thought, well, we need more Christians on the ethics committee. So the beginning was very straightforward and simple and not a revelation or anything. But anyway, I got on the committee, and pretty soon I started thinking, well, if I'm representing Christ on the committee, I could do a lot better job if I had some training. And so I checked out the programs, and Trinity Graduate School in Deerfield just has a really good program for people who are in full-time jobs, but who can try to sneak away for a week here or 3 days there. Mm-hmm. And over the course of 24 to 36 months, you can get a master's degree. So anyway, I got involved in that program, and I got up there, and in the summer plenary session, I can't remember what year, it might have been 2000, for instance, Ben Mitchell gave a Saturday afternoon plenary on the importance of Christian scientists, nurses, doctors, lawyers, social workers getting involved in teaching the church about ethics. And as part of my program, I had the option of doing a thesis, a major project, or a comprehensive exam. And so at that point, I thought, well, why don't I take Ben's advice and complete the project for the course, for the degree at the same time. So that's how it got started. And then you end up, you know, revising the project 3 or 4 times or 6 or 8 times.
Sure.
But it eventually came to fruition.
Paige, I know that you were excited about this book. You approached me back in February. Maybe tell us a little bit about your interest and the reason why you were interested in this.
Well, first of all, because I know Bob. So he sent me the book, and to have a book where you know the author makes it come alive to you. But sure. it's more than just knowing Bob, who preceded me in the program. He was an earlier graduate. But it was the focus of the audience. This is for the, I would say maybe the uninformed, unengaged, but faithful church, you know, who really do want to live godly lives and live with wisdom, but frankly aren't aware that they are actually making bioethical decisions not every day, but in their everyday life. That these are not just the exotic decisions that happen in research labs. These are decisions that affect ourselves, our families, our children. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And what I say to people is, when I'm trying to introduce them to bioethics, is to say that you will make at least one bioethical decision in your life, whether it's for yourself or a child or an aging parent. But the problem is you don't know when that's going to be. And if you wait until that decision time to become grounded and informed, to have your moral conscience formed, it's a little late. The decisions that we make under stress and pressure with intense emotions are usually not the best decisions. So what Bob is doing here, Dr. Cranston is doing here in this book is kind of laying out the landscape of these issues so people say, oh, I can relate to this, or I can relate to this, or I can relate to that. I don't know how to think about it. And so I think it's just a wonderful tool because it's very accessible. It's easy to get through. Yeah. So it's not like, oh, this is some academic thing. I just, I don't know how to read this. This is very approachable, and it gets people to say, wait a minute, I don't know what the answer to this question is. So that's why I was excited about Bob's book.
The thing that I love about the book, and I've actually read through it twice, and it's when you see the cover, it's kind of intimidating because like, oh, bioethics, but it's such an easy and engaging read with the stories that he uses. But also, I love the way that it is set up where an individual can read it, but it also has the group questions. And I would love to see church small groups go through this because, like you said, these are the type of issues we are facing more and more. And as a pastor, I know that sooner or later, somebody in my congregation is going to come to me for advice on some of these issues.
If you're looking for a small group that's going through it, and you live in the upstate of South Carolina, our adult Sunday school class at Golden Grove is going through this book right now. So come on over.
Yeah, let me follow that rabbit trail. We are using this in Sunday school, and let me say that now that we're in it, the series is going good, but Sunday school is an hour, and what we're beginning to find is you really need like an hour and a half, 2 hours as you tackle these chapters. So maybe the more ideal setting is an adult study. And I think that even, Bob, you kind of recommend that somewhere at the beginning of this book, that might be a better setting, and I would just concur with that. Go ahead, Bob.
I would just say absolutely. Unfortunately, Sunday school for many people is less than an hour, and it starts with general announcements and maybe an offering and greeting people, and then you get about 30 minutes to talk. And unfortunately, half the people that show up haven't read their Sunday school quarterly for the day. That won't help you really grapple with this stuff. The way to really deal with it is to read it ahead of time, to think about it, to look up the scriptures, hopefully to buy a few of the books that I highlight and read those chapters as well. And if you hit it like that, by the time the quarter's over, you'll be surprised how much you've learned. So anyway,
coming from a Wesleyan tradition, there was a nice little surprise in this book for me. You really lean heavily on something called Wesley's quadrilateral. Tell our listeners what that is and why it plays such a prominent role in this book.
Well, I'm a big admirer of Wesley. My own faith tradition includes a lot of thoughts from him. A number of other spiritual leaders, though, have given Christians kind of guideposts to help make major decisions. And so there's a lot of overlap. But Wesley picks 4 things, and he says you need to line these things up when you're making personal decisions or corporate decisions for the body of Christ. And the 4 things are, I remember by the mnemonic REST. In my mind, I think if you do all this, you can rest knowing that you've made a good decision. But the 4 things, the R stands for reason. And some Christian traditions are so mystical, they almost throw out reason. And Wesley says, don't do that. The second is experience. And that stands for thinking back the way that the Lord has used you and other people that you know, and also how the Holy Spirit has been witnessing in your heart over time and as you pray about it. S is for Scripture. And you might say, well, Scripture doesn't talk about ventilators. It doesn't talk about petri dishes or embryos. Absolutely true. But it does have a lot of principles that do apply. And if you think through the principles involved. And then the last one is tradition. And I think to piggyback again on Paige's comment, I admire the Roman Catholic Church for having grappled systematically with major issues. And unfortunately, us Protestants are so dispersed and diffuse in many ways, most of us haven't really done that. However, within Protestant evangelicalism, there are some phenomenal voices that are coming forward and are talking about these things. My hat's off to Paige in the work that she does there. She's a perfect example of someone who's grappling, engaging the culture.
Right.
And if we read things from Paige and if we read things from her colleagues, it really helps us. And I call that tradition. So we talk about the ancient traditions, the church traditions, the church creeds. But we also talk about the new evangelical traditions that are emerging.
We live in this day and age where life expectancy in the United States is longer. We can talk about all the wonderful aspects of modern medicine, and yet it also has its downsides. So from a practical point of view, I wonder if each of you could give an example of this where modern medicine, while a blessing, can also be a curse. Bob, I'll start with you, and then we'll move to you, Paige.
Well, maybe I'll start with blessings because I think a lot of people are fully aware of them or more fully aware of them. We're able to take a woman who delivers a 25-week, 26-week-old child and nurse that child to normal, healthy life many times.
Yeah.
Now, there may be some disabilities, but we couldn't have done that 50 years ago. That was totally out of the question. I talked with a guy on Saturday at lunch who'd had both of his hands blown off, hanging by the skin, had them completely reattached, and now has two quite functional hands.
Wow.
I mean, that just blew me away. They did the first hand reattachment back in the late 70s, early 80s when I was a med student, and to actually see his hands that really work. Those are two examples. In vitro fertilization would be another one. I mean, this is tough. It is a miracle in some ways, but it's a thorny miracle. And then as far as curses go, you could talk about the curse of the person that's, on the ventilator for months. And in the old days, that wouldn't have happened. The family made a decision and we would have moved on.
Right.
But I think a worse curse is this crazy sense that we really do control our own destiny. And I think a lot of Americans feel that way. A lot of scientists feel that way. And in point of fact, that's not true. And I think that's part of the curse.
Wow. Very good. Paige?
Well, let me talk first about the blessing as well. As I have interacted with some of the most wonderful Christian doctors, it points me back to what is the pursuit of medicine all about. And so many people say, well, it's to cure disease, it's to heal. And that's not really the whole story, because particularly the end of life is where this becomes so important, because it's not curing at that point. And so if you think medicine is about curing, what happens to care and comfort? But these Christian doctors know and live out that when they can no longer cure, they don't abandon their patient. They still provide comfort through palliative care, and they still care. And it's that care and comfort that Christian doctors are maintaining in the noble pursuit of virtuous medicine. That is the blessing of medicine. And I think medicine at its very, very best and very highest calling. But the curse has been the overlay of technology into medicine, where it's not just medicine, it's biotechnology or biomedicine and engineering, which can do wonderful things like reattach hands, but also there's this tendency to the medicalization of every aspect of life. And let me just give one example. That is the behavior of children. We can use drugs not just to help children who have serious, attention deficit disorders or ADHD, but also children who are just wiggly or energetic. And from our own family, we had a son who in 3rd grade, the doctor and the teacher agreed that he had ADHD, and he was put on Ritalin, which he hated. He didn't have ADHD. He was a future drummer who had rhythm, and he just kept fidgeting with his pencils.
Very good.
And so we've been down that path and saw how easy it is to medicate our children and to control behavior through medicine. And the danger is that in so doing, we're narrowing what is acceptable behavior, what's acceptable personality.
Wow.
How about our future entrepreneurs, our future artists, our future entertainers? Those are not conventional kids generally.
Right.
And what are we doing in saying that they have to conform to a certain model of classroom management? So that is something that deeply concerns me as a parent and as now a future grandparent, the medicalization of every aspect of our life.
Oh, very good. It's interesting. The two of you come from different disciplines. Paige, you bring law to this whole conversation. Bob, obviously, you talk to the medical side of this. So I wonder right now if we could just kind of segment this. And Paige, what does law bring to the table of bioethics? And then once you're done there, Paige, then Bob, you can just answer the same question in terms of what does your profession bring to this.
Well, law is a wonderful thing. It is a guardian of civil society. It is necessary for us to live together in a liberal democracy, which I think of all the government systems is the best and most just kind of system. Law decides who is protected and who is punished. But in the case of bioethics, law has determined who counts as a human being who is entitled to protection. And so we saw in the case you mentioned, Tony, of Roe versus Wade back in 1973, the Supreme Court decided that there were certain human beings, a whole class, who were not counted as persons. And let me just take a minute and unpack what that means. Up until that point, when you said person and human being, those were interchangeable terms. There is a philosophical understanding of who is a moral person, but we weren't saying, well, you count as a person for this purpose, but not for that purpose. But what the court said is because the embryo or fetus cannot people can't agree if that counts as a human being or not. We are going to decide that that is not a person for the purpose of what's called constitutional protection, which is our right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So fetuses, the unborn, were excluded from that category of people who get constitutional protection. Therefore, their right to life was not protected. So that's where the law has set the course for a whole array of decisions, not just regarding abortion, but in the areas of assisted reproduction, of people with disabilities, of the end of life, things we call substituted judgment, that I don't think the court really understood what it was doing by dividing the human being into different parts. There's a legal person, there's a biological person, there's a moral person. So that's one example. The other side of it is that with the areas of biotechnology, which we haven't really touched on too much, the law lags behind and seems to really struggle with how to protect, how to guard the values of liberal democracy. So the law is not the place where you want to begin in setting values for society.
Let me jump in here because on this, I'm just going to kind of fast forward a question I was going to ask later, but part of what we seem to be dealing with here, you talk about the law lagging behind is, and either one of you can answer this question, but we get into this thing of there are things that we can do, but the question that seems to be not asked is, should we be doing them? I mean, doesn't that kind of enter in here somewhere?
In terms of the law?
In terms of the law, but also in terms of just things that are being done. I mean, you referenced the embryo. And so we could make a list of things that you can do now with the embryo. The question is, or the point I'm trying to make is that we haven't really thought some of this stuff through. We can do it, but should we be doing some of the things that we're doing? I mean, isn't that part of this conversation?
Exactly. When the court said, could have limited its decision just to abortion, but once you have said that some human beings are worth less than other human beings, that certain human beings can have life and death power over others. In this case, it's mothers who have the life and death power over their unborn child. The father of the child has no ability to protect that child legally. The grandparents have no say. So once we've said that you can make these decisions for certain human beings because we don't really think they count as full persons, where do you draw the line? Yeah. And certainly embryos that aren't even in the womb but are in a petri dish seem to be just a natural place to go for biomedical research, because we use this argument that Bob introduces people to in the book of, well, they're going to be thrown out anyhow, that the end justifies the mean. Why waste this great resource? And so we're now in a position where I think for the first time in human history, this generation is consuming, if you will, the seeds of the next generation for the hypothetical benefit of people who live now.
Wow.
When have we ever done that before? When have we ever sacrificed a future generation to meet our own goals? And let's, outside the area of stem cell research, what about genetic engineering, where we try to manipulate the genes that are that may be permanent changes? We have huge power, but we're not acting responsibly.
Paige, do you think, and Bob, you can answer this as well, do you think that over the last 50 years, when it comes to science, Christians, because of the whole evolution debate, have kind of fled from scientific discussions, and so on a lot of these issues, Christians have just stood back and thrown rocks at people, and we haven't engaged, and so we find ourselves almost now behind the 8 ball trying to play catch up. So how do we re-engage with the culture instead of throwing rocks, build bridges?
Let me ask Bob first, since he works from the inside.
Yeah, I absolutely agree that it's much easier when you're trying to pick a career to say, I would like to pick a career where my colleagues would respect my basic tenets. And when you know that you're going into a biological science especially, and there are many basic tenets there that you might well disagree with people on, it's easy to avoid the area completely. My son has a PhD in mathematics, but you see, that's clean. There's no argument about where things began or who matters. And he had no problem in a major university. But see, it was totally avoiding some of these touchy issues. I think the same thing happens in obstetrics. I think that now a lot of Christian medical students who may have wanted to go into obstetrics are kind of frightened away from the field because they say, I don't want to have to put up with the disdain of my colleagues, and I don't want to have to fight in my residency to not do abortions, and life is just going to be easier if I don't do that. So
well, yeah, I never thought of it from that perspective. You have something to add to that, Paige?
Yeah, I do. I was at with a group of college students last fall, actually talking about human-animal hybrids. And I just stopped in the middle to encourage students to go into the basic sciences. As Christians, many students will pursue medicine, although, as Bob pointed out, there are certain specialties that are becoming more and more difficult to live as a Christian. But we have even fewer young students who are interested in the basic sciences. And I just stopped and encouraged them. And someone emailed me right after that, and he said, thank you. He says, I've just been feeling so uncertain, and to be encouraged to pursue a career in science as a Christian is something that we want to foster, because science is about the understanding of how God created the world, and we know why the world works. We know why the sun rises. We know why the electrons hold together. We don't have to be afraid of that. And yet, yes, there are challenges, but the challenges are growing for each of us, no matter what arena we're in, because the enemy of our souls does not want us to succeed.
Very good. And also there is a price to pay if we take ourselves away from the public arena, from the table.
We give up our voice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, boy. Good stuff.
The Catholics make a big point, and perhaps better than the Protestants, about the sins of omission and commission. It's easy to say, I was rude to my wife, I shouldn't have done that. But it's harder for us to realize, I should have done something about this sooner. I should have been involved in this cause sooner. But I took the path of least resistance. And I think, unfortunately, many of us do that.
Bob, let me get back to you on this question I asked Paige earlier, really both of you. What does your profession, and especially you as a Christian, what do you bring to the table in terms of the medical side of this whole issue of bioethics?
Paige mentioned in passing the three concepts of cure, relieve, and then comfort. And I think it's at Johns Hopkins. There's actually a statue that says that. And I've researched it, and there are various people who get the reference for that, supposedly having said it first. So it certainly wasn't me. But the goal of medicine then is to cure when possible, to relieve often, and to comfort always. So I think that little triangle is the beginning. Now, a lot of people these days are throwing in to optimize health. And I think we have to be careful on that one. I think that is part of the picture, for instance, in getting prenatal care for poor women in the inner city. But on the other hand, does it really include putting all your bright young students on Ritalin so that they'll retain information better, so that they'll get higher ACTs, so they'll get into better universities? I mean, that's another issue there, so optimizing. So I'll leave that one alone for a minute. But I read an interesting book on marriage, and I am sorry I can't remember the author's name. Maybe one of you will. But it's the idea that what if God created marriage not to make us happy, but to make us holy? Ooh. And that gets back to the whole concept that we have this obligation, we have this covenant with this person and before the whole church, till death do us part. No matter what, I'll be there. And as a physician, I think that's one thing that we do bring to the table, is we have this, it's almost a holy covenant. I guess I would say it is a holy covenant. It's a vocation, it's a calling. And the calling includes the three things at least that I mentioned. And it includes the concept of being a fiduciary, meaning I hold the goods, either the wealth or the human body or the spirit of another person in my hands. And I have to treat that with tremendous respect. And a good doctor is coming to the table with all of that. Whereas I think a good scientist may have some of that or may not have that, but that isn't really a part of the basic package. So I think that if a doctor abandons that vocational calling to this fiduciary relationship, you're just an engineer, you're just a scientist, which are nice things, but they're completely different.
And if I could just add one more thing to that, because this is what I've heard in so many conversations with doctors, is that because so many of these decisions involve medicine and technology, the doctor is seen as the fulcrum for the moral decision making. And so when couples are struggling with issues like infertility, for example, if they go to their pastor, the pastor may say, well, I don't understand this, talk to your doctor. And the doctors are saying, patients are coming to me for moral advice and spiritual counsel rather than their doctors. So oftentimes, because of the great respect we have for doctors, because of their expertise, they're also seen as being the spiritual counselor. And this is why, just to go back to the reason for Bob's book, is pastors, I think, need to step up to the plate, if I may, and see that there are some spiritual dimensions where they are to be the shepherds, and not to expect the doctors to do the job of the pastors, and not to expect the pastors to do the job of the doctors.
Ouch.
And so I'm glad that there are Christian doctors, but we're asking an awful lot of them.
Paige, that is a good word. Yeah, Matthew just said ouch over there.
Yeah, thanks a lot,
Paige. Sorry to poke you there, but
Paige, we didn't bring you on the show to badger pastors, okay?
No. This is I hope a divine and a positive encouragement that these are, let me just say, these are not add-on issues. This isn't like one more thing to put on your plate that you have to juggle. This is a way of understanding your theology and how you prepare your congregation. And it goes back to that fundamental question, what does it mean to be made in the image of God? And if I could just insert some philosophy here, it is an ontological statement. It is a statement that by virtue of existing as a human being, we are made in the image of God. It has nothing to do with our capacities. We do not earn it. I'm not talking here about being made in the image of Christ, being a new creature in Christ. I'm talking about being part of the human family. Yeah. And even within the evangelical church, we have seen this tendency to look for certain capacities that enable us to either count or not count as part of the human family. And so that we're able to exclude some who don't quite measure up because they don't have the capacities that we happen to think are important. Some philosophers think it has to do with your ability to form social relationships. They're very social philosophers. There are others who think it has to do with your cognitive abilities. They're very bright philosophers. But as Christians, we know it doesn't have anything to do with your ability. Yeah. It has to do with that statement of reality. We are made in the image of God. It is a profound mystery. We can't fully unpack it. But as we see that how we see our congregation, how we understand, how we respect each other as human beings, how we acknowledge each other's existence, whether it's in the grocery store or on the highway, says something about our understanding of being made in the image of God.
You talked
so it's just to underlie how we think about how we teach and preach the word, rather than saying, oh, I have to equip people on a specific issue. There are other people who can help with that. Sure. But the theological and spiritual shepherding is the pastor's responsibility.
Right. You talked about pastors stepping up to the plate, and there was a time in history when the church was at the forefront of every issue, scientific discussion, art. The church was at the forefront, and there's so many topics that the church and pastors have shied away from, and when we do that, our people go to other sources to find the answers. And I think, again, it's about pastors stepping up to a plate and addressing these issues from the biblical perspective and helping our people kind of walk through.
But it takes being intentional about that.
Absolutely.
So like these guys, they were able to step up to the plate, but they knew what was going on. They weren't blind to what was happening around them. And that's the thing that aggravates me with people, because I can see the pastor stepping up and making a grand statement, totally uneducated in what he's saying, and it's like, oh my word, we have to be intentional about figuring out what's going on, having our pulse on the finger of culture, on the finger of these, on the pulse of these things. Yeah.
Hey, Paige, I'm just struck by your comments. You talk about the image of God in theology, the Imago Dei, we call it. And I think you and I know a person at Trinity that is an extraordinary guy, wonderful person, Perry Downs. And throughout he and his wife's marriage, they've had, I think, 32 foster children. And they adopted one of those. Her name is Angel. She is profoundly handicapped. I had an opportunity to meet her a couple of years ago. And for 18 years, Perry and his wife, Sandy, never took a vacation together because she needed 24/7 care. And Perry can go into detail of what that care involved, and it was extreme. And I remember one time he was telling the story, and he said, you know, I've had people ask me, well, why would you and your wife take this responsibility on? And, you know, he jokingly says, because I'm a wonderful person. I mean, you know, Perry. And then after the laughter dies down, Perry said, because she's made in the image of God.
Mm.
Mm-hmm. That's it. That's living out what we say we believe. And part of our mission at the Center for Bioethics and Human Dignity is to help the church live out what we say we believe. Because if we don't live it out, we don't truly believe it. And we can't believe it until we understand and know what we're talking about.
Hey, Bob, concerning this book, so tell us a little bit, what are your hopes for this book? What would you hope the church would do with this resource?
Well, what I would hope is something that you brought up earlier, that you'd get engaged adults, maybe as young as high school, if you have highly motivated high schoolers, college, and then beyond, and that they would grapple with it, hopefully either in an extended Sunday school class where you'd come early or in an evening class, and that the leader would really have some of that technical background. Now, it wouldn't have to be a physician or a nurse. It could be a scientist. It could be a science teacher from a high school. It could be somebody who's just willing to do the homework in advance before each of the courses, before each of the discussions. I think it's imperative that people understand that you're not going to get this by just kind of showing up and having a bull session. It just doesn't work that way. And
you mean there's not? Wait a minute. There's not 4 easy steps here, Bob.
That's right. One of my friends used to talk about Bible studies in the church. Often are shared pooled ignorance, and you know, and I think BSF is a perfect example. Largely in women's ministries, but often in men's as well, where to show up for the course each week, you have to have completed your homework, or else you're not allowed to say anything. To me, that level of commitment, if we could apply that to something like this, things could really go places. It might encourage people to go into science, like Paige is saying, or medicine, or law, or theology. But it may shift people's whole lives. If you could do that, how many people does it take to change a generation? The answer is it's amazing. Sometimes it's only a few. We think of Wilberforce. He wasn't just by himself in England. There were a number of people at the time who were working with things, with the abolition movement along with him. But they were brave voices that stood up and took a stand, and they changed the world. And if you say, what would be your perfect dream for this book, it would be if we could light a fire under a few people and move in this direction. I would be forever gratified.
Well, very good. As we just wrap all this up, I wonder, first Paige, if you could just tell us a little bit about the Center for Bioethics and its purpose and what you all do there.
Sure. The Center for Bioethics and Human Dignity is a Christian research center at Trinity International University in Deerfield. And we explore a distinctly Christian conception of bioethics. And our goal is that we continue to do that thought work at the level of what we call the academy, the intellectuals, as well as I said earlier, to help equip the church to live out what we say we believe. And the reason why it's so important to do that thought work, which I would call sort of the far horizon work, looking out and seeing what the emerging threats as well as opportunities are, is that ideas have consequences. Yeah. Right now, the notion of human dignity is under assault, and there are some very well-regarded philosophers, bioethicists, who are saying that the phrase human dignity has no meaning at all. And in fact, they use it as kind of a swear word to say, oh, those nasty dignitarians, they're the ones who say no to everything. Well, I am one of those nasty dignitarians because I believe that human dignity is absolutely central to our being as individuals, but also as a culture. So we work on two fronts, on both the thought work front and the what I call everyday bioethics front, which is what I do in my weekly radio commentary, is unpacking and translating one bioethical issue into everyday language so it's accessible and understandable. And let me just say one more thing that we didn't touch on earlier, but just to bring this home to families, is that the understanding of family is being fractured. Who is a parent? This is another area where the courts have had a real difficult time figuring out who is a parent. When you have an egg coming from one person, sperm coming from another, you have another couple who's putting them together to make an embryo, another woman who may be gestating the embryo, or another couple who is adopting the embryo. Who is the mother? Who is the father? Wow. What does the church have to say about this? What do we have to say about parents and families? So we are wrestling with those profoundly important issues from a distinctly Christian perspective.
Paige, I had an opportunity one time there at Trinity. You were speaking to college students, and you gave a case study, and it was about an embryo, and it was the whole issue of who owns this thing. I think that was a real eye-opener for me, and I have to say that I don't think that the average churchgoer has a clue of the complexities here. And so even that evening when I left a little bit overwhelmed in terms of the education that needs to happen within the church, just so there's a basic understanding of what's happening in bioethics. And I would guess that one of the things that you're trying to address there is to produce those that can go out and do that.
Well, if I could just put in a little plug for what we're doing at the center. First of all, our website is easy to find. It's our initials, cbhd.org. We have another site it's under construction right now called Everyday Bioethics. Very easy to remember, which will have those more broadly accessible resources. Every summer we have a national conference, and this year I was really recruiting pastors to come because we were talking about the Christian voice in bioethics. Is there still such a place? Next summer's conference, we're going to be looking at issues on dignity and the child of choice, although it's not just going to be limited to the issues of procreation and reproduction, but broader issues of dignity, particularly as it affects women, but not exclusively. And so for pastors who are in the Chicago area, I would encourage them to come, even if they can come to just one day of the conference. Sure. And we are also building a church bioethics network to do very short, like one morning seminars to give pastors kind of the fundamental introduction from theologians to pastors to help equip them in wrestling with these issues from the perspective of theology and shepherding their people.
All right. Bob, let me turn to you real quick. As you continue there with your practice, where do you see your responsibilities, where you plug into this whole thing in the future in terms of the bioethics?
Well, I think there are a number of ways that Christians can plug in. I think you have a largely prophetic voice of people like Paige who are out there trying to rouse the Christians to understand what's going on and take action. I think that's extremely important. You have some Christians who are involved in policy of a state level or national level, and I think that's very important. Then you have practitioners, physicians, social workers, chaplains, nurses that are working kind of where the rubber meets the road. And that's part of what I do. The other part is I have a leadership role in our hospital ethics program, where the hospital ethics committee if it's doing things right, has a number of mandates. One is a policy review on a hospital level. Another one is ethics consultation. Third one is ethics education. And the fourth one, which doesn't get as much funding, but is ethics research. So I see myself as being answerable on some of those things. Also, Todd Daly and Dr. Thomas are at the Urbana Theological Seminary, and they're beginning to work on another local center that will focus on educating pastors some. So Urbana Theological Seminary has a website that you might want to follow up on that. But Todd and Dr. Thomas and I are going to be working this fall with some national, with a truly national, international figure and some local experts, and putting on a local educational symposium. So I see down the road that as being one of the things that I'm called to. And then I wonder if the Lord is going to call me into more of a more widespread influence thing, possibly writing, possibly lecturing. But, you know, you just follow the Lord and you employ reason, experience, scripture, and tradition.
Yeah, very good.
Where He's leading you next, and you just take it a day at a time.
All right. Well, Bob, Paige, we want to thank you so much for joining us today. We're certainly going to keep you guys on our radar screen. You have the freedom to contact us anytime to let us know of things that are out there, things that will inform the church. On our website, we will certainly promote these things that you have talked about. As we close here, Paige, if we have someone that we've inspired today that wants to look into a degree in bioethics, can they just go to the website you've already mentioned?
Yes, if you go to the website and you click on Trinity International University, it'll take you to that the information about the degree program. You can go either through our website or the one that's for Trinity International University. So we try to get you there as easily as we can.
All right, and they could be living somewhere else and come on campus and still do this. Is that right?
Absolutely. I did it on weekends and a couple of summer conferences. There is a full-time degree which you can complete in 13 months, and we've had a number of recent college graduates do that. But for most of us, the reality of our lives is, as Bob said, you know, you give up a vacation here, a 3-day weekend there, and just, you know, fill it in as you can. It's designed to be flexible that way. More of the courses are now being available via live streaming or online, so that may also help certain students, particularly those that live internationally and can't make the travel.
All right. Well, as always, thank you, and look forward to seeing you in the future, Paige. And Bob, I hope in the Lord's providence our paths will cross here in the future. Want to thank all of our listeners for joining us. For those in the chat room, let you know, coming up on our schedule on September the 14th, we have Dr. Keith Drury, his son David Drury, and they'll be discussing their book, Ageless Faith. This ought to be a very good...
It's a great book, by the way. A great book.
Yeah, and
Keith Drury. I mean, so that'll be just fun in itself.
and both of these men are going to be different aspects of the way they approach worship. So, yeah, going to be fun. You were going to say something there?
Yeah, I actually did a review of the book on chaseyourlion.com. Just go there and search for Ageless Faith, and you'll see my review of the the book.
Yeah. Our good friend Steven Sheets is going to be our guest on September the 21st, and we have given him the privilege to kind of give us some stories, things that he wants to discuss that he thinks are important. So,
and I will be writing his introduction for that day.
I was going to say this: if the show is a success, it's because I invited him on. If it's a failure, it's because he
picked the topic.
Yeah, that's right.
Way to leave yourself an out.
Also, this is tentative, but we're scheduled to have Joan Rampey and Fawn Woodfin as our guests on September 28th. They're going to be discussing this whole thing of trying to discern the will of God in the midst of unexpected change. Some of you will remember when we had Zach Woodfin on. He is the assistant strength coach for the Green Bay Packers. Well, Fawn is his wife. She had a great ministry in Southern California, and when he was called to go to the Packers, you know, she had to leave that abruptly, and it was interesting just watching some of her posts as she was working through that, and she graciously has said that she would come on the show. And for Joan Rampy, her husband is our district superintendent, and she has really followed his profession and times had ministries, and then when he's had to switch churches or felt the Lord moving on, has had to kind of wrap things up, start all over again. So I think that that's going to be...
She's been making Buddy look good for
many years.
Yeah, you got that right. Yeah, isn't that the truth? And then we're excited about this. We're going to start off our very first show in 2012. Heath, who's our guest?
I was Mark Batterson. That's right, the Mark Batterson, one of my favorite authors. He actually has a new book coming out the end of this year. And so he'll be on the show to promote that, and we're going to talk with him about a lot of different topics.
What an awesome guy, too. Pastor at National Community Church in Washington, D.C.,
guy.
if you don't know. I got to be there at the church a couple months ago. Just fantastic. And what a fantastic passion he has. It'll be a good show.
I remember, you know, he was at the gathering, and I was so nervous, and we were just thinking, boy, if we could just get an interview. And then he was just like, oh, yeah, absolutely. Well, here's what we're going to ask you. No. Let's just do it live. And I'm like,
okay.
All right. He was, I mean, a lot of times you meet people you admire and sometimes you're disappointed.
Right.
He just
didn't disappoint whatsoever.
No, he was awesome.
Yeah.
And he's tall.
Yeah. he made you look tiny, man.
Yeah.
There's a great, go check that out. It's on YouTube on our show account, whatever.
Yeah.
There's our interview with Mark Batterson, and there's little Heath standing next to 6'7" Mark Batterson, who we didn't ever realize was so tall until you stand right up next to him.
Maybe we could do some medical engineering to get you taller, Heath. All right, Heath, where can our listeners find you?
They can go to chaseyourlion.com, and there all the links to my social media and all that's on there. So come join us.
All right, Matthew.
You can find me at matthewtg.com.
All right, and Bob, for your book, I guess our listeners can go to either Cross Books Publishing or Amazon. Is that right?
That is correct. I haven't actually looked me up on Amazon yet, but
you are there.
You're there. I bought 2 books there.
We put the link up in the chat room, and there's only 2 copies left. So hurry up, folks.
All right.
Well, thank you.
All right. Our listeners can find me at facebook.com/AKC64 page. If our listeners want to get in contact with you, what's the best way to do that?
Probably the easiest way is just through our website. There's an info email there. So it's info@cbhd.org, and that's probably the easiest thing to remember. Okay. So, and I also want to just tell you, Tony, how much I appreciated your cat joining us today. That was just a real treat.
Oh yes, that cat is the most. That's the most faithful listener to the show right there. She comes down every week and sits right there.
I see we've put her to sleep. So.
All right. Again, we thank our guests. Thank all our listeners for joining us today. Those in the chat room, encourage you, if you want to contact us, you can go to, send us an email at thetechnologyshow@gmail.com. Better yet, if you'd like to call us and leave a voicemail, you can contact us at 3049-THEOLOGY. That's 304-986-5649. Leave us a message. We may even play your comments on the air. Thanks for joining us. Goodbye, everybody.
Thanks very much.